Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Around D3 and to checking out all things Division 3 soccer with Simple Coach and Jackie. I am Simple Coach. That is the Chief Dog Officer, Jackie. Yeah, she's keeping an eye out on things. Hey, listen, this is my first Around D3 since the season, first of 2023. Figured I would sort of try to put something together, especially as there's been some information mostly around rule changes and some other nuggets that I thought I would throw out there, and you know, hopefully keep you tuned into the game even though there are no games. So with that, let's get rolling. Okay, so let me begin with a topic that is very exciting during this off season: basketball. Um, so, turns out my Mount Union Purple Raiders are pretty darn good in basketball, and they're actually ranked fourth in their in the country. So, well, I'll just pull this up. Share. There we go. And as you can see, they're fourth. They are behind Christopher Newport. Oh, St. Joseph's number one, Randolph Macon number two, Christopher Newport number three. But let me just say, this relates to soccer. How? I can confirm still of something that I was made aware of during the season. So for a while there, a particular school was pretty good, and so I tried to check them out, and I can confirm the University of Paywall is still behind a paywall. You may have heard about some recent NCAA proposals that were voted on at the National Convention or whatever they hold, and they voted on a few of some proposals that had a really direct impact on Division III soccer, other sports as well, but Division III soccer. The small one got passed. The bigger one was defeated. So let me just talk about the defeated one first. Okay, so proposal 2023 number 12, I guess, is how you would read that, is this broad ranging proposal to change the fall preseason practice formula for other sports than football, which means that football has it, but the other sports do not. And one of the big things that coaches had been talking about, who are big proponents of this, is to create some sort of acclimatization period for fall sports. In other words, what that would mean is that they would have a longer preseason to get student athletes up to fitness, so that when the first games roll around, they have had more time to train and do such things. And it was basically started with, from the first game, going back 18 days to start practice. The first 7 days would have to be this acclimatization period during preseason. Obviously, you would need still the rule is that you need a day off during a 7 day period, for a week, including during acclimatization. Why can't I say that word? And then, yeah. So that one was defeated. And why was it defeated? The Benjamins, right? The money, I think, right? Because you do that, you're now having to house and feed. Those are the two areas that I think, because if it's preseason, right? You come in early, that's what they have to do. If it was during the regular season, not so much. And the unfortunate thing is, I think this was a big miss. I think this was a big miss for Division III soccer, for really the health of the athletes, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about the overtimes, but I think, right, the overtime rule, the lack of overtimes during the regular season, that was an attempt to have a better, to preserve athletes and for their health and for player load and all those things. Here's something meaningful, right, for that very purpose. But clearly what's the difference is that the lack of OT versus the longer preseason, there's money involved. So it had to do with the spring season. So let me pull it up. And this one actually passed. And so starting in 2024, this I think, well, for soccer, the spring of 2024, they're going to have uh, 8 more days of training. No more games, but 8 more days of training. So it used to be measured, the period used to be measured in weeks. So you had, you can only train, you have 5 weeks to train or whatever the case may be to meet within 16 days. They've added a degree of flexibility. And so rather than saying weeks, so you'll have 5 weeks to do your 16 practices. Now you just have to say I have 24 practices. So you can have 24 practices over that spring season, which I think I've raised it in any number of my simple coach to coach interviews about, hey, extending the spring season. And I have yet to hear someone say or vocalize that they were opposed to it, that they preferred to keep their spring short and prefer the longer period of time. And I think by and large, everyone was very disappointed about the proposal that was defeated to add that acclimatization period to the fall season, to preseason, basically. So this one passed. So, like I said, in 2024, there's going to be more time to train. You're going to have 24 days to train. Now, a missed opportunity here. I don't know if it's, hey, we'll take whatever we can get type scenario, but right, they currently only have the ability in that time period to play one game, and that's a lot of training for just one game. So, I think it was Coach Franchino at North Central who brought it up, and I didn't even think about it. It would have been great if they gave us 1 or 2 more games to have, so then you could have 2 or 3 games throughout that 24 or day window, which I think would make a big difference. And if you're a ball player, right, you just want to play. So, but anyhow, we continue to make progress and march forward. So. The observation about, and that I also ask about in my simple coach to coach interviews, about the overtime rule. So no more overtimes during the regular season. And so I've been asking coaches, and it's a little bit more mixed. I think there are some coaches, Coach Dayon at John Carroll, was opposed to it. Again, Coach Franchino was supportive of it at North Central. Doesn't mind having no overtimes during the regular season. So, in the midst of this, I too, as a YouTube influencer, I have my inside sources who provided me with data and information about that I thought was really interesting. And so, every year they do surveys of the coaches and sort of to get opinions about things, so that the rules committee can sort of act on these different proposals or ideas that have come about. So in this one in particular, they did a survey around overtimes. So do you want it? Do you not want it? The first time they did this survey was, I guess, last year or 2 years ago. I don't know when, but it had 41% of respondents. So in men's world, you're looking at 406 ish. And then, 41% of 406 coaches. And then on the women's side, you're probably looking at, and somewhere in the vicinity of, uh, you know, 41% of 430 coaches, give or take a few coaches, right? So a little under half. But in this latest version, I guess that came out after the season, 55% participated. So clearly a big jump, because this is a little bit of an interesting conversation to have, since, and I'll show some information that I collected on overtime that I just sort of looked at, that there was a definite jump, and I actually would argue that there was a bigger jump in overtime, or in ties, let's say, that were left unresolved because there was no overtime, than in the past. So, but I'll show you that. But in the meantime, let me pull up the data on. Okay, so here is the um, the latest survey asking coaches about the elimination of regular season overtime, and it's just a survey to get an understanding. And you can see, when it comes to D3 on the D3 men's side, 62% of respondents had a positive opinion of the eliminating the regular OT, 30% negative. On the women's side, 67% were positive, 30% were negative on having OT. So clearly a majority of the respondents that are in favor of having, or of not having, no overtimes during the regular season. And I mean, I'd be curious to know what it was before, like before the first surveys came out. Like, has it changed? Has it, was it higher? Was it lower? But unfortunately, I don't have that. And maybe Deep Throat, if you're out there, if that can be provided, that would just be fantastic. So again, it's just interesting, right? Because there's clearly a majority. This isn't razor thin margins for this. Now, let me also say, what's not visible or understanding of what people don't understand when it comes to the NCAA Rules Committee. Division III soccer, despite the fact that they have a majority of teams, right? I think Division I has half the number of teams that Division III has, as an example. We're at excess of 400. I think the Division I teams are in the 250 range. So clearly, but on the rules committee, you get one voting member on the women's side, one voting member on the men's side. And the sort of, because they have double, Division I and Division II have double the number of votes. They're sort of beholden to the actions of those other divisions. So I think that's the unfortunate reality. So if all things held true, and then these votes flipped on the Division III side, that they wanted overtimes, if Division II and Division I did not want it, they would never go back. So just keep that in mind. Which leads to this next part of this OT discussion. So in my desire to figure out this whole overtime thing and just sort of look at it a little differently. And maybe even because I have nothing to do on the weekends, I took a look at overtimes in 2019, 2021, and 2023, just to get a sense as to how each year looked. And I'm not saying this is magical numbers. I got this stuff off the NCAA website. I extrapolated where I could and just tried to figure out things. So I'm going to pull this up. So let's start with the women. This is 2019 women's soccer Division III. There were 430 teams that participated. There were 8,013 games in Division III that year, women's games. You could see the number of wins were, obviously there's going to be a relatively even distribution for obvious reasons. 3,727 wins, 3,674 losses. They tied 612 games. Now, if you just look at the loss ties, that represented a little over half of games were categorized as a loss or a tie. Why I did that, I don't know, but I thought it was important at the time. Now, each team in Division III, just by averages, played anywhere between 18 and 19 games. So they won, on average, 8 to 9 games, lost 8 to 9 games, and tied probably 1, maybe 2, right, games. That would be the average distribution of those games. Hope College led the country with 6 ties at the time. And teams that had 4 ties or more, so 4 ties or more, there were 27 teams that had at least 4 ties or more. The average of those turned out to be 4.3 ties, so 4 ties. The mean was just slightly under that. So most of those teams had 4 ties. Most of the 27 had 4 ties. Come to find out that there were 600 overtimes, 650 overtimes in 2019 Division III soccer. So looking at the tied games and looking at the 650 overtimes, it dawned on me. They said, and I don't know if this applied to the women's game, but they roughly said that half of all overtime games ended in ties. Right? Half of overtime games ended in ties. Okay. So if that were the case, then in this particular year, I would have thought that you would have seen 325 ties roughly, right? Because half of 650 is 325. But clearly that's not the case. Because of the 650 ties, there's a difference of 38 that got resolved in overtime. And again, maybe it's different on the women's side, but so I kept going. Going for not for my sake, but for your sake. In 2021, post-COVID, unfortunately, we lost 7 teams. I don't know which ones, but there were 7,443 games. There were, 3,441 wins, 3,422 wins, and there were 580 ties. Right? Which is interesting. How does that happen? How do you have more ties than overtimes? This is the data I can't figure out. So to lead the country. I'm sure there's probably some like tracking, right? Because a lot of this ends up being manual. I think like you team guys record their scores and what have you, and it gets processed, and maybe that's the reason. I don't know. It was post COVID too, so lots of excuses there. Beloit College at the time in 2021 led the country with 6 ties, and there were 27 teams with 4 ties, identical to 2019. Same thing, average of 4.3, the mean was 4.2, and 555 overtimes. So there was more ties than overtimes in this case. But regardless of that, I would have expected, based on what we know, the 50%, there would have been 275 ties, right? Because that 50-50 split. So, yeah, the data on the women's side is not as clear to me as to how this all worked. But let's take a look at 2022. Hey, we found some teams back. There were 429 women's teams out there. 7,731 games were played. 3,295 wins, 3,260 losses. The number of ties almost doubled. Right? There were 11,706 ties. Average number teams, the average for teams is that they played 18 games. They won 7 to 8 games, lost 7 to 8 games, and then tied probably 2 or 3, closer to 3 games, which is basically added a tie game per team on average. Lewis and Clark on the women's side had 8 ties. So if you notice, the previous ones each had 6. Lewis and Clark comes in at 8. This is the one that startled me. The number of teams that had at least 4 ties was 141 teams. 141 teams. We did 27 in the 2 years previous. 27, from 27 teams with 4 ties to 141 teams with at least 4 ties. Average and the mean obviously jumped up by about half. So clearly more teams. And in this case, because there's only overtimes for tournament play, so conference tournaments and the NCAAs, a dramatic decrease in overtimes, down to 61. But you can see why, right? Like the numbers just got added back into the tied column. So if you looked at it, you're at 3 times the number of teams had 4 ties. Absolutes, right? So there were 3 times more teams, if you look at the analysis, that had four ties. So 66 teams of that 141 were at 4 ties. Even more so, there were 11 times the number of teams that had 5 teams. So there were 64 teams of that 141 that had 5 ties. So you can see, like, it's a dramatic increase in ties that I'm not sure is explained. And my rudimentary statistics here doesn't help to understand it, in large part because I don't have access to data and information. And quite frankly, I do have some things to do on my weekends. So I just figured I would stop there and while I'm ahead. So that was the women's side, and let's take on the men's side now. Okay, So now let's talk about the men, because I think this is a little bit more interesting. I think for a lot of reasons, I think that the differences are more pronounced on the men's game, especially with the ties. So let's take a look. Let me pull this up again. My fancy schmancy Excel spreadsheet with colors. Okay, so 2019 men's. There were 409 teams competing in Division III men's soccer. There were 7,724 games. There were 3,569 wins, 3,500 losses, 655 ties. Average close to 19 games per. You can see the distribution here. Little higher, 8 to 9 wins, 8 to 9 losses, and 1.5 ties. So one a little bit higher than that on average. Middlebury College and MIT were tied with 6 ties to lead the country. A little bit higher than them on the men's side than the women's side. 38 teams had at least 4 ties. So that puts an average of those teams, of those 38, about 4, little over 4. Mean was the same. It's 4.3. So the interesting thing here is that there were 749 overtimes. Right now, again, we go back to over half. Again, the stat. I'm just saying. I haven't confirmed this with Deep Throat or anything, and I really haven't probed it. But the stat that I had heard was that 50% of overtime games became ties. So I'm wondering if that is the case here. Maybe it was. I don't know, because you have 749 overtimes and 655 ties across Division III. So that, I just look at those two numbers, unless somebody can make sense to me, help me understand this, it only looks like, let's just say 100 overtimes were resolved with scores, were resolved in a win and a loss. I don't know. Am I looking at it wrong? I don't know. Okay, so let's go to 2021. We lost some teams, 406 teams, 7,220 teams. This is post-COVID. Won 3,321, lost 3,296, and tied 603. So it's consistent, right? Like if you look back, 655 ties, 603 ties. So, a little bit more competitive, less ties. Hey, that's a good thing. On average, you saw a drop in games, so below 18, so 17 to 18 games. If you won a little bit over 8, so 8 games, you lost 8 games, and you tied 1 to 2 games. That was your average team. That was sort of their record. Ithaca College, the Bombers, led the men's in 2021 with, again, 6 ties. What's interesting here is that there were 28 teams with at least 4 ties. And again, average sort of comes out at 4.3, and then the mean is 4 for all intents and purposes. There was in all of these cases, the majority seems to be 4, right? In both the men's and the women's in 2019 and 2021. And again, here, which I'm failing to connect, 676 overtimes in Division III men's soccer in 2021, with 603 ties. That was the total. So I look at that, and my first inclination, without understanding or having an explanation, is that the reality is that only 73 of those 600 ties ended up in a result. with a win and a loss. Am I, again, help? I don't know. So let's go to 2022, where now the overtimes are gone. During the regular season, they're only on for the tournaments, so the conference tournaments and then the NCAAs. And so let's see what we have. Okay, so 2022, we found 2 teams they forgot or something, and 408 teams. Men's soccer Division III, 7,415 games played total. There was 3,036 wins, 3,007 losses, 1,372 ties. On average, teams played about 18 games, right? We're sort of in that range, 17, 18. Won 7 to 8, lost 7 to 8, tied 3 to 4. So it basically doubled, right? It's basically doubled. Now we all know, and this is not a reflection of my opinion of Williams soccer, even though I'm sure I know some folks will ping me at some point being like, you just hate Williams. I don't. I'm just reading. Williams College led the nation with 11 ties. So the previous 2 years, we had teams leading with 6 ties. This is a jump by 5. The crazy part here, again, is that there were 175 teams with at least 4 ties. Let me say that again. 175 teams with at least 4 ties. And if you remember, in 2021, it actually went down from 2019, but there was only 28 teams with at least 4 ties. All right. The average obviously goes up in those 175. So on average, those teams, the average was 5.1 ties per season. Of those games, of all the games, only 86 games went to overtime, right? So they were conference games, and then they were NCAA tournament games. So 86 of those overtimes went to were tournament, right? Which, this is the interesting thing, which I'm trying to figure out, right? Like, are those again, some of those will be reflected as ties, the way actually all of those will be no, it's just the overtimes, right? So those would be some of those are reflected as ties because that's the way the NCAA counts it. Like, if you have to go to PKs, you're tied. That's how that's what the record reflects. So, but look, the total number of ties doubled again. More than doubled in this case, 603 in 2021 to 1,372 in 2022. There are, of the 175, there were 3 times as many teams with 4 ties. So there were 61 teams that had at least 4 ties, that had 4 ties, 11 times of teams had 5 ties. So 65 of those 175 teams had 5 ties. That's 11 times more than what was reflected in 2021. So there's a lot here to uncover, especially as we go, because let's face it, overtimes are going to stay. Right? I just think that's the reality, which is fine. Like, I'm not, and this isn't a case for overtimes or not against overtimes. Personally, I just like the emotion of it, right? I don't care the before or the after, but those are the games that you just sort of remember, that are seared in your mind, like just complete battles. So, but if they're not there, there's other ways that emotion will be expressed. So I'm okay with that. But I just thought the data should be highlighted. So if I droned on a little bit too much about the OTs and I'm just making molehills out of molehills, I apologize. But I did find it interesting. I was just sort of looking randomly, and there's a lot more to this than sort of you think. So, or at least I think, and just trying to take a look and especially at this point where we went from OTs to no OTs during the regular season. So I hope that's okay. And like I said, because I think it's equally interesting on both sides of the game, right? Both the men's and the women's. So, but I wanted to end this show on some other interesting news. So when I started this channel back in November 24th, 2021. I made a video on passing, and I watched way too many games. Like, I don't recommend it to anyone, but I watched way too many games, counted passes. I've talked about this before. You could still see the video. It's like literally the first video that I did on this channel. And at the time, I had three subscribers. Me, simple player number 3, and simple player number 1. And simple player number 2, I think, was like, yeah, no, Dad, I have no interest whatsoever in your YouTube channel. And my goal was to get to 100. And it took well into the spring to get to 100, and I thought I was the bee's knees. And then just the other day, lo and behold, who would have thunk it? I hit 1,000 subscribers, which I thought was the coolest thing, because in the back of my mind, and I told the simple players that I too could become an influencer and get 1,000 subscribers, and they didn't believe me. So I just wanted to take a moment, thank all of you who have subscribed. More importantly, thank all of you who have taken the time to watch, comment, all that rigmarole. And I really do appreciate the feedback, appreciate the support. It's so cool. I mean, the fact that Division III soccer, there's other like-minded people out there who share this crazy interest in it is really neat to see. So if you're a subscriber, thanks. If you're not, what are you waiting for? Yeah, thank you very much. And I will continue to do this. I've said, as long as I keep enjoying it, I'm going to keep doing it, and I'm still enjoying it. Love talking to coaches, players, and just sort of being involved in the banter. So I will throw out this to any other Division III coaches that are out there. It's no shame to email me and say, hey, I'd love to get on your channel. I would love to do an interview. There's so many teams out there. I'm just scratching the surface. So if you have the stomach, then I have the will to do it. So feel free to reach out. Again, thank you for this. It's been great, and it was a great year, and hopefully this year is going to be even better. So lots of blessings. Thanks. You want to say goodbye? Yeah, she's out. If you like this show, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. You can also find me on anti-social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks. This is a message from my Chief Marketing Officer.